to be with you today, and it's going to be a special day because I went into our archives about 10 years ago. I sat down for an interview with John Ashcroft. He had just left public service not too long before that, has one of the greatest careers of anybody in public service. He was the Attorney General for the state of Missouri. He was the governor of Missouri for 2 terms. He was a senator from Missouri for 2 terms, and he also served President George W. Bush as Attorney General. It was such a pleasure to talk to him, and I felt that some of the things that were mentioned in that interview are appropriate today. We talked about 9/11. We talked about various things in government, and it was kind of a troubled time after 9/11, but we have a lot of problems today that we really need to address. So I thought it would be very refreshing for you, as it was for me, to go back and listen to what Mr. Ashcroft had to say. And so we'll go to that interview now, and I'll be back.
Do I call you Attorney General, Governor, Senator, all the above? John.
You know, I spent about 40 years in public life, but I intend to be a human being when I die. And rather than referred to as a position, I prefer to be referred to as a person. And I don't think when you go into public office, you ought to lose your personhood, if there is such a thing as personhood.
Well, I didn't know exactly what the title should be, but when you were a little boy, did you ever think, I'd like to grow up and be a governor, a senator, and an attorney general?
Well, no, I don't think so. And it's uncommon that anyone would have had the series of opportunities that I've enjoyed, you know, with state offices for the first 20 years and then national offices oriented toward the national scene for the last, 15 years or so.
Well, your father was a minister, I understand your grandfather as well. Did you ever consider going into the full-time ministry?
Yeah, I did. When I was a senior at Yale, there is a foundation called the Rockefeller Foundation that funds 1 year of seminary training. And they had signaled to me that I would be the recipient of one of those 1-year funding if I would, in good faith, take the funding and to figure out whether I should do a couple more years after that. And I may have been mistaken about this, but I came from a tradition that said, if you went into the ministry, you needed to hear the calling of God on your life in indelible terms. I had actually heard preachers say that if there's anything else you can do, you ought to do it. And with that as my guide, I said I couldn't in good faith take the year. I would have enjoyed the year of theology and the studies associated with it, but I didn't intend, at least had no sense of a real specific calling for my life.
I have read your book, which, what's 3 years old now, 2 years old now?
A book called Never Again.
Never Again, yes.
Yeah, that book's about 5 years old.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Something like that.
But there's a good story in there about your father. I think perhaps when you were first sworn in, first time a senator in your office, do you know which one I'm talking about? He started to stand up.
Oh, well, I know the story you're making reference to, and this was a tradition in at least in my life, that before I would go into a public office to serve the people, I would ask for my father and others to help me with a sort of little service of consecration or prayer. In each of my times as being governor, and prior to my time as being the state auditor, and prior to my times as state attorney general, we had an opportunity to invite the blessing of God in what we were doing. So I had hoped to be able to do that before being sworn into the United States Senate. And the chaplain of the Senate, Reverend Halverson, was pretty sick when I was elected to the Senate, and so they didn't have, I had asked if they would have a service of dedication and consecration in advance of the swearing-in ceremony, and became pretty clear that they weren't doing that. So we assembled the family members of the family in Washington. And on the morning of the swearing-in ceremony to the United States Senate, I asked members of the family to join in a little service where we would simply say, want to start this day by inviting the wisdom and the integrity, the blessing of God in my opportunity to serve in the United States Senate. My father was feeble as a result of having had several heart episodes, and he was seated in a sofa not nearly as well made as this sofa upon which I am now resting. And when it came time to pray, we, in our previous efforts or services, we had anointed with oil. Maybe going back to the Davidic or David's
Right.
being anointed and asking God to bless. And when it came time to actually pray, the others in the room gathered around me. I was kneeling in front of the sofa, and my father was in a feeble condition, but in the sofa, and he started to swing his arms to gather himself from this deep sofa, which sort of had almost swallowed him when he sat down in it. And I said, Dad, you don't have to stand to pray over me with these other folks. And he continued to struggle, and then he said, I'm not struggling to stand, I'm struggling to kneel. And he rolled out of the sofa onto the floor and then knelt with me as the others gathered around for us to have the prayer of consecration.
What a treasure. What a
Well,
treasure.
I think it symbolically, I've given a lot of thought. If more parents weren't struggling to stand over their children, but were struggling to kneel with their children, and if they were, instead of meeting them toe to toe or nose to nose, were meeting them knee to knee, I think it would change the culture. And,
I have no doubt. I've looked at I want to go over a little bit of body of work you've
Sure.
done. You have written books, and with your wife, who is a law professor as well, correct?
That's correct.
You held other offices, but on your last term in the seat of the governor, you got 64% of the vote, which is outstanding. You balanced the budget 8 times. In the Senate, you pushed for a balanced budget. You had a perfect pro-life vote. You wanted to end Social Security as a slush fund. I think that you ought to grasp that one.
Well, we need to have a Social Security fund that's funded
Yeah.
and that has stability and certainty rather than one that is in such danger as it is now.
And I've heard they use it for a slush fund. And you were against that 99% attendance record. So when I read that, I thought they're the only thing left to really criticize is your faith, which they've done very well. Where were you when you learned of 9/11?
Well, I was in a small jet flying from Washington, D.C. to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The president had asked members of his cabinet to help promote literacy and help young people understand the value of good reading skills. So I was on my way to read with a 5th grade class in Milwaukee when we were, and I remember quite well, I think we were between Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo. I think Kalamazoo would have been off the right wing of the airplane, Grand Rapids off the left. It was a day which I refer to as a severe clear, beautiful fall day, and we had flown from Washington. It always charms me to see the geography of the country out of those small jets where you have good visibility. You just literally, it looks just like the map, and that shouldn't surprise me,
Yeah.
but it almost always does. And when the captain barked out of the cockpit that I was to call what was called the command center in Washington, and you could be summoned by the command center for any number of things of far less importance, but this turned out to be an earth-shaking announcement.
Well, were there any contingency plans for domestic airliners flying into buildings? What's the first thing you do? You clear the airspace? Is that the first thing you do?
Well, I had ordered the plane be turned around and we head back to Washington. At times like that, I think sometimes you feel you better exercise your authority, and the pilot says, I can turn the plane around, but we'll never make it back to Washington. We don't have the fuel. So we descended across Lake Michigan, landed, refueled, and then we got back into the air. And one of the first things we wanted to do was to clear the air. We didn't know which airplanes might be threats. We hadn't adequately anticipated, obviously, the threat that could be undertaken by making a weapon of an airplane itself and using its fuel load as the sort of energy that would combust or otherwise intensify the damage beyond the damage of the collision. And
Brand new territory, right?
well, in retrospect, it was probably newer than it should have been. I would have been pleased if I had been able to figure this out in advance. But when we talked about the elevated risks of terrorism back then, it always seemed related to, and the intelligence community said it was related to events and episodes like the ones we had with the USS Cole in Yemen overseas, the embassies at Dar es Salaam, and the other embassies that had been bombed. So we were not anticipating this kind of episode. We went back to Washington, and getting the planes out of the air was the first major task.
Yesterday, as we make this tape, yesterday we learned that these packages that are being found, and most of us didn't know that a lot of these packages arrive on domestic, on passenger aircraft, but it's said that it was 17 minutes from blowing up. Have the threats changed, and what are your own thoughts when you hear that there was just something diverted in that?
This may be less surprising to me than it is to others.
Yeah.
I saw enough of and learned enough about the commitment of the terrorists to destroy us and to disrupt our way of life, so that I expect them to continue. I think it is a habit in America to let bygones be bygones, or to let the past be the past. And we don't have a very long memory sometimes. I think it's very important for us to understand that the terrorists continue to have an intent to destroy us, to disrupt our way of life, to displace the freedom we enjoy with an imposition of what they consider to be their moral code and that religion on others. And America obviously rejects that, and because we do, we're their prime target. So we still live in a very dangerous world.
So you're not surprised?
There's another cultural thing. I think perhaps probably because of the very medium that we're using now, television, where most dramatic circumstances are resolved either in the half-hour program or the hour program, and it's over. You know, you got 28 minutes or what it is with 3 or 4 commercials in between, and then it's over. We are pretty much what I would call an episodic culture. We package an episode and that's over. And I think the Middle Eastern culture generally, and certainly the extremist terrorist culture, which is obviously, there are lots of people in the Middle East that aren't terrorists.
Right.
They're victims of terrorism in ways that we aren't. But it's an intergenerational culture. They have a sense that, well, if I don't get it done, my son will get it done. If my son doesn't get it done, my grandson will get it done. And this intergenerational sort of culture is to be counterpoised, and it obviously, that's the way they look at it. We look at it episodically. It's to our detriment if we fail to understand.
They keep their eye on the goal.
Their eye on the goal, and if their goal is destruction for the United States, we're going to live with this for a long time. On the day when I was in the airplane, learned of the disasters at the Pentagon in New York and in Pennsylvania, I turned to my staff in the airplane and I said, the world will never be the same. It didn't take me long to figure out that if this is the kind of destructive capacity that people would deploy to achieve their ends forcibly, and they only do that because they can't get people to subscribe to what they're trying to do in the marketplace. If they could get this done by convincing people it was right, they could have a free opportunity to do so.
Yeah.
But they can't market it, so they seek to impose it.
We learned in the 9/11 Commission that there were 2 factions of government. I think it was the CIA and the FBI, but I'm not sure, that would not share information. Now, I'm just a plain vanilla person. I cannot understand how that could happen. That would keep the American people from the utmost safety.
Yeah. Well, it was even a little bit more difficult than the CIA versus the FBI. Within the FBI, which is an intelligence agency as well as an enforcement agency, there had grown up a doctrine in the law that there was a wall between enforcement authorities and intelligence authorities, and that because intelligence was collected in a way that was inconsistent with using it as evidence in court trials, it was thought that we couldn't have the exchange of information. And ironically, 2 weeks before the 9/11 attacks, one official in New York said, this wall, which has been erected between the components of our law enforcement system and the intelligence system, will cost us lives someday, and the only person to benefit will be Osama bin Laden. Now, we didn't know about that memo until after 9/11 because it was sort of buried in the bureaucracy. But the person turned out to be eerily prophetic in those statements. And one of the things the Patriot Act did was to say, no more wall. It may be that we won't be able to use certain things that we collect by way of evidence in criminal trials, but that doesn't mean we can't use them to protect the well-being, security, the liberty, and the freedom of the American people.
That should be first. Okay, our way of life could be completely obliterated with a serious attack. So within the Constitution, is there anything that could suspend some liberties temporarily?
Well, I think there are. I mean, the Constitution provides that the right of habeas corpus is subject to suspension under certain conditions, and that's constitutional. Other people would argue that the President of the United States in emergencies has the right to do things that wouldn't otherwise be appropriate. The Deputy Attorney General of the United States in the Clinton administration, the administration which preceded mine, testified before Congress that for national security purposes, the President had the right to enter and search a person's home without a search warrant. Now, I think this is where you start to, for national security purposes, but not necessarily for criminal prosecution purposes, so that things gained in the search might or might not be available for use in a prosecution. The rights of Americans are to be guarded and safeguarded. And the reason we have defense of this country is we believe in freedom.
Yes.
And we should be very tender about any infringements on freedom. When 9/11 happened, I went back to the Justice Department, which is the place that the Attorney General operates, and I said, we must think outside the box. We have to do things differently than we've ever done them before, but we can never think outside the Constitution. And we will not destroy our liberties in the process of safeguarding them, or it would be an irony that would be unbearable throughout history.
You have been vilified for your faith, and I just wonder, personally, how does that feel? How does it affect your family, or do you just consider the source and go on with your life?
Well, I'd never sought to be vilified for my faith, and I always hoped that if I were ever charged with being a Christian, that there would be enough evidence to convict me. I don't feel that I am a good Christian. I guess I feel like I am a Christian because I need the goodness of God, not because I'm good on my own. But I look at people around the world who are really persecuted, and I laugh at what happens to me. There are people who lose their lives every day, people who are beaten, people whose houses are burned, people who are wrongfully imprisoned because they have a faith and abiding love for Jesus Christ. And so I got, dragged around and made fun of, and cartoons made about me. I
You have a scrapbook?
What? No, I don't keep a lot of that stuff. I believe in eternity, not in history. So I'm not trying to create history. And I'm not trying to tell myself that there's a verdict either of public opinion or a verdict of history that's relevant. It's the verdict of eternity that counts. And the book that's important there is not a scrapbook. It's a different kind of book.
Yes. We get an opinion of Washington from the media and all, but I've kind of learned there's a lot of good Christians there. There's a lot of prayer meetings. things that never get any publicity. Is that true?
Well, there are people that I consider of faith. You know, it's kind of strange. I sometimes go into evangelical settings, and of course I'm an evangelical, and people say, how many real Christians are there in Washington? And I usually say back, God only knows.
That's right.
You know, and I don't want to be judgmental about people who call upon God to help them. I know that God, I'm hoping and praying, and I believe that God will overlook flaws in my life and in my theology. So I'm not out there to try and judge flaws in other people's lives or theology. I figure if God's going to forgive mine, I hope he forgives theirs along with him.
How did your faith sustain you? I would imagine that you lost so much sleep and you were running on adrenaline and all. But when you come up knowing the Lord from a young age, you know what a solid rock he is. Did you rely on that a lot in the decisions you had to make?
You know, when I became Attorney General of Missouri back in the 70s of the last century, can you believe that? That sounds really antiquity.
Yeah.
I started a little Bible devotion in my office before the workday. I would start it so that when time came to go to work, we had already completed that. And I did that regularly through my time as Attorney General and as Governor and United States Senator, and I would invite others in. When I got to be Attorney General, some people were offended by the fact that I would ask for God's blessing. I was with the President of the United States in Philadelphia one day, and after we finished a press briefing, news conference on working to suppress gun violence in the country, we were going to stop by and see, I believe it was Cardinal Bellavacqua of the Catholic Church, and in the car the President looked at me and said, "John, I read in the paper you're having prayer meetings over there at the Justice Department. Is that true?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. President." He said, well, keep it up. So I don't, you know, it is a commentary which troubles me in some measure about our country, which has a fear of people who believe in God. And unfortunately, I think their fear is well-founded in some quarters to this extent. Some people want to use public office as a place to impose their religion on other people. I don't want to do that. It's against my religion to impose my religion. If God chose to leave people free to say yes or no to his call, who would I be to say arrogantly, well, you fouled this up, God. I'm going to make those people do what you forgot to make them do. It would just be one of the most arrogant, irresponsible, unchristian things. So I don't believe that spiritual matters are a matter of imposition. I think spiritual matters are a matter of inspiration.
I can't remember Jesus imposing himself on people as
No,
well.
the only sort of violent thing he did was not in the governing structure, it was in church.
Right.
And it wasn't to impose religion on the church, but it was to expose the church for having gotten so far afield that the house of prayer was no longer true to its purpose. So if Jesus came, I think, tomorrow or today, and he might, and I hope he comes to my life every day, as a matter of fact. I hope he works in me to expose for me the things that are wrong and that need to be weeded out.
The title of your book, Never Again, which tells a lot of the story of 9/11 from your perspective, does that never again also mean politics?
I think it's fair to say that now, and it did at the time I wrote the book. I really enjoy my absence from politics. Not as much as I'm sure some people enjoy my absence from politics.
Well,
there were people been trying to get me out of politics for a long time, and I've finally joined forces with them.
Well, your history in politics is amazing. All of the offices you've held and so forth. And personally, I believe we're safe because of the Patriot Act. And I'd like to thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
And I would like to thank you for giving me this time. I appreciate it.
Well, the Bible says, except the Lord guards a city, the watchman watches in vain. There are lots of things that were done, including the Patriot Act, and lots of hard work by people that together with God's grace has continued to make America a safe place. And it's my prayer and hope that we have that same combination in the future.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Arthelene would like you to keep the following information handy. You may contact Homekeepers by writing to Homekeepers, P.O. Box 6922, Clearwater, Florida 33758, or go to www.rippy.org. Remember, we always enjoy hearing from our viewers, and we thank you for your support.
That interview was taped about 10 years ago at the First Assembly of God Church in Fort Myers. And I would like to again thank Pastor Dan Betzer for making it happen. And hopefully you are like I am. I love my country, and I deplore what is happening right now. But my father, who was a preacher, would say, America has forgotten God. Friends, that is the bottom line. And so much of what we're seeing today is because of teaching in our universities that America is bad, and then those people go and teach our younger children in the schools. And so this is what we have on the streets right now. But when God is removed from a nation, you can expect this. You can expect riots, looting, violence. But if we just looked at the scripture, what it says about a nation, because God created nations for a purpose. It says, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. He said that when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. The scripture says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn, friend, that's the church, turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven. I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. And that is very, very true today. It's time for the church to rise up and be the part of the nation that she should be, and that influence. We're out of time, but I'll see you next time. And please remember, there's no higher calling than that of a homekeeper. God bless you.
If you should miss a Homekeepers program, you can catch up by going to www.ctnonline.com. Click on CTN Programs and then on Homekeepers.